Ray made me late. Do I need this, you guys, or can you hear me okay? All right, you guys. Testing 1, 2, 3. Does that sound good? No? Can't hear me? I guess I got to turn it on. All right, here we go. There we go. Welcome you guys to Tuesday morning. I know this is a different setup for us. We're today obviously here in the chapel because of VBS. After the study, we will be in 204A and 204B for some heaven-sent chorizo and egg burritos. I truly believe, you guys, that was manna from heaven. And so also, Andy will be here selling tickets for our Steak and Study. He'll be here in 204, 205, 204A after the study to sell tickets for our July 30th Steak and Study. You know, I do want to introduce a brother that's joined us for the first time. Anybody else here for the first time? Oh, welcome, Lonnie. Brother, what's your name? Richard. Welcome, Richard. Everybody welcome Richard. And Lonnie. And then we have Jaime. Let's welcome Jaime, you guys. So, what I was sharing with Jaime earlier is that, you know, with the Steak and Study, it's of course another privilege for us to get together and eat. But more than that, it's to continue what we gathered at the men's conference with the no excuses. And I wanted us to continue to exercise ourselves towards godliness. And so as we carry out the theme, because when we're going to have an on-campus retreat this year, looking to go off campus the next year. But for this year's theme, I was thinking of the theme, Vessel of Honor. And how else can we become a vessel of honor unless we've exercised ourselves towards godliness? And that's been involved with our men's ministry, with the studies, with the different things. So that's the reason why we're having our Steak and Studies. It is to eat, of course, but it's to continue our growth. And Jaime and I were talking, you know, as husbands, we need all the prayer we can get, right? As fathers, we need all the prayer we can get because we're in a battle. We're in the battle fighting for our wives and fighting for our children. And so, you know what, you guys, I got to do something here really quick. They
can't see it.
They can't see it? Why? It's on. Who?
They can't see it.
Who's they?
Joe Vasquez.
Tell them to come to study.
It's on. Hey, you guys online right now, are you able to see, just answer yes or no, are you able to see those I see logged on? Are you able to see the study?
Yeah, I can.
You can? Okay. We're on, bro. So that's the reason why. And also, I want to lift up Bill Arianis in prayer. You know, he's home now, and he's decided not to continue with the chemo. And so let's lift Bill up. He's one of our brothers here in the Lord. Father, we thank you so much for our time together, Lord, and I lift up Bill before you. I pray that you bring complete healing to him. And Lord, there's a brother that I was able to go see this last week, Arthur, who's now put on a ventilator. We pray that you bring healing to him. And Lord, there's a lot of things that we're going through. We ask for healing and for your guidance. And so, Lord, bless this study in Jesus' name. Amen. Then after the study, you guys, we're going to go through this book called Victorious Christian Living. We're going to meet in the chapel green room after. We're going to go through this together as we continue just a more intimate study setting. It's by Ellen Redpath, and it's going through the book of Joshua. And there's some cool things in this book that I'm looking forward for us to go through. So with that, I want to welcome those who are joining us online. Was Joe able to get on?
Yeah,
Welcome, Joe Vasquez. Glad you're able to get online. Let's turn to 1 Kings chapter 11. And then next week, you guys, we'll be back in the banquet hall. Can you guys see okay? Do you guys need more light? You're good? Whoa. And John said, he'll be struck down here. 1 Kings chapter 11, starting with verse 26. Then Solomon's servant Jeroboam, son of Nebat, an Ephraimite from Zereda, whose mother was Zerah, a widow, also rebelled against the king. Now last week, how's that sound, you guys? That sound okay? Last week we were introduced to two adversaries. Ooh. How about this, you guys? Is that good? No? Microphone? Yes? Can you hear me okay? That's a lot better, huh? Last week, we were talking about how two adversaries were introduced into 2 Kings. That was interesting is that the Lord raised them up. When we usually talk in Christian circles about being raised up, we use it as a positive sense. The Lord's raising the brother up to serve in the ministry. Oh, see how the Lord has raised him up? Oh, it's amazing to see how God has raised this person up. And when we hear of the Lord raising up, we oftentimes think of it as a positive thing. But here in chapter 11, we see that two adversaries have been raised up for the purpose of the consequences of Solomon's disobedience. And when it talks about here in chapter 11, as we look back a little bit, it says that the Lord raised up, after he became angry, he raised up against Solomon adversaries. It says in verse 14, the Lord raised up an adversary against Solomon. The word adversary there in the Hebrew is the same word where we get Satan, Satan. An adversary has one purpose in its life. One purpose to do is to accuse, to destroy, to disqualify. And the purpose of this adversary here that was raised up by the Lord was the result of Solomon's disobedience. What was he disobedient in? Remember in chapter 11, it says that his heart was turned away, that his heart was no longer loyal to the Lord. So what does that tell us as men? That tells us that our hearts are not to be turned to anything else, and that our hearts must be loyal to the Lord. There is no such thing as half loyalty. And on the flip side, Max and I were talking, I seen Max somewhere, and there's no half disobedience. We're either obedient to the Lord or we're disobedient to the Lord. We're either fully loyal to the Lord or we're not. There's no middle ground. And Solomon began to love many foreign women. Well, we can sit here and say, wow, that's crazy. You know, it tells us in verse 3 of chapter 11 that he had 300 wives, 700 wives. I mean, us married men, one's enough, right? Couldn't imagine 700. And that he had 300 concubines. Do you ever notice that when our hearts are turned away from the Lord, that the pursuit of things for us, that when it's too much, that's never satisfied. There's never too many. And we see here that Solomon's disobedience of loving many foreign women, as chapter 11 starts off, it said King Solomon loved many foreign women. In chapter 3, it said Solomon loved the Lord. What happened? He took his eyes off the Lord. And you know, as men, as we pursue careers and we pursue family and we pursue different things, it's so easy for us to turn our eyes away from the Lord, and it can happen so subtly. Here, we've seen a blatant eyes turned away from the Lord, and then later on, it's the gods of these wives is now who Solomon is building high places and sacrificing for. And we can say, oh, how disgusting that is. How disgusting that they're worshiping Ashtoreth, the sex goddess. She was also known as the goddess of war. How disgusting, how can he pursue that? Well, if we put it in today's terms, don't we also a lot of times pursue sex, power, and control in certain things? It may come in the way of a title. It may come in the way of how we treat our wives. And there can be subtle ways that this god of Ashtoreth is still worshipped in our day. It may not look like this. And then in chapter 11, it tells us in verse 7 that Solomon started building high places to worship Molech. Molech, a god who is a bronze statue, half human, half god. And it was a god of war. It was also a god that was worshipped for power. And what they would do in the Middle East is that they would, especially the Ammonites, they would have this tall statue of Molech with his arms open. And what they would do is they would heat those arms until that bronze turned a white color. And then they would lay their newborn babies or their babies on top of those arms, and listen to the screams and the wailing and the pain and the agony that they were suffering, and they were worshiping their God. And we think how disgusting that is. We think about how can somebody do that? But let's translate it to today. What are we sacrificing that we're putting our children on that same thing? Is it the pursuit of money? Is it the pursuit of job? What are those things that we are doing that are putting our babies on that same arms? May not be burning, but they may be crying because they've been sacrificed. That spoke to me. Doesn't mean I'm giving up golf, because golf is of the Lord. So we see that there have been these adversaries that are raised up for the consequences of Solomon's disobedience. We read about Hadad, who was raised up. Not too much is mentioned to him, but he's been raised up as an adversary to Solomon. Then there was another gentleman named Rezon. He's also somebody that has been raised up for the specific purpose of Solomon's disobedience. And now today we're going to look at a third one. But what's interesting is that in chapter 2, verse 12, we once read about Solomon's kingdom as being firmly established. Now we're going to see chaos and division and a splitting and a tearing of the kingdoms as a result of disobedience. In 1 Kings chapter 5, verse 4, it says, "But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side. There is neither no adversary or evil occurrence." That was Solomon's prayer at one time. There was rest on every side. But in Solomon's willful disobedience, we now see the consequences and destruction in the result of the Lord raising up adversaries against him. And the person that we're going to look at here in verse 26 can only be really understood in two lights. That the wrath of God is against wickedness, and God is faithful to his promise. This is what we're going to see through Jeroboam. And again, as we mentioned, the word adversary is a Hebrew word for Satan. Satan is the adversary, but these are going to be used as an accuser. What's interesting about this is that anything that's been raised up as an adversary first has to go through the hands of the Lord. Sometimes we can say, oh, why is God being so bad on me? Or why is God this? And why is God that? One of the first things I look at in my heart is there anything that I'm doing in disobedience? Maybe there's something that God has raised up in my life as an adversary that I must check my spiritual condition. Why is this happening? A lot of times we can just push it off to the Lord. Oh, the Lord doesn't love me. Maybe there's something in our life that he's raised up that we can fully understand what we're going through and say, Lord, I'm in disobedience. The adversary that is raised up is our accuser. He's the one that wants to distract you. He's the one that wants to disqualify you. He's the one that wants to destroy you. See, man, you have a high priority target on your back because you're men of God. You're faithful men of God. I mean, what other faithfulness could men have than to be here at 6:30 in the morning listening to this? Faithful men. God, the enemy has a priority on your back, a priority target, and he wants nothing more than to distract you, as we've seen with Solomon. His heart was turned away. He wants to disqualify you. Solomon was disqualified because his heart was turned in disobedience, and the Lord is ripping the kingdom away from him. And then the enemy wants to destroy you. You know, there's no greater destruction within the churches when a man of God falls. Yesterday, I met up with a couple, and I'm going to keep it as anonymous as I can. And he had been in ministry for 47 years. And they're coming because of adultery. And I asked him, when did your heart turn away from the Lord? And he looked at me like, you're crazy. I said, no, this is a serious question. At what point did your heart turn away from the Lord where you stopped doing devotions and you stopped praying, you stopped coming to fellowship, you stopped reading your Bible, you stopped being involved in church? I said, when did that stop? He says, well, I've been pastoring for 17 years. Good. When did your heart turn away from the Lord? Because if it wasn't turned away, you wouldn't be here today. Talking about the devastating destruction of adultery. The enemy is an accuser that wants to come and destroy you, shame you, disqualify you. How? How does he do this? Anything that gets your eyes and turns your heart away from the Lord. That's how. You know, I'm thinking about the things in my life that can easily turn my heart away. And I joke about golf, but it can. My wife can turn my heart away if I'm not careful. Ministry can turn my heart away from the things of God. Position, title, recognition, serving, all these things can literally turn my heart away from the Lord if I'm doing it for me. And we see that Solomon's selfish heart, as he turned his heart away from the Lord in his older age, is that I'm going to get mine. I've served the Lord. I deserve this. I could imagine this is what he's thinking. And he says, I am just going to do this. And the Lord raised up adversaries as consequences. And there's nothing more than the enemy wants than for the kingdom, the temple that has been entrusted to you and in your hearts, to be torn away from you. We're going to see here, as the kingdom has been torn away from Solomon. When we look back at verse 13, as we're looking back at chapter 11, verse 13, he talks about it, that God's going to tear away a kingdom from Solomon, but not the whole kingdom. He's going to piece it up. But the fact is that a kingdom has been torn away. And when we're in disobedience with the Lord and we think we can get away with it, it's just a matter of time before not only is it exposed, but it will be torn away from you. And as men, we must be on alert. We must walk circumspectly. We must walk worthy. We must be aware. We must put on the armor of God because we have an enemy that is waiting for us at these doors as soon as we leave here. And we must be men that are mindful of this. But in all of this, and we looked at verse 26, that because Solomon sinned and Jeroboam's now going to be raised up and the kingdom's going to be torn away from him, we see that even then, God still hangs on to his promises. Isn't God's promises amazing? Because regardless of the path that we go on and we come back on that path, God's promises are still yes and amen. He still wants to do a work in us. And God's promise to David is that he would establish his kingdom forever, even when Solomon jacked it up. What's amazing about that is there are times we can jack everything up. I mean, I think my middle name should be Jacked Up. With all the things that I jacked up. Can anybody relate to that? But yet, God's promises are yes and amen, because he will bring us around and put us on that path where his name is glorified and honored. And he says here in verse 13 that this is all done for the sake of my servant David. I want to just take a couple of moments when it says that the kingdom will be established for the sake of my servant David. We think of Jesus, the true and faithful servant. And it's because of him that we're able to enjoy the freedom in Christ that we have today, and that we may be in right standing for the Lord. We need to always remember that for the sake of God's high servant, that we're even where we're at today. For the sake of Jesus Christ is the only reason why we've been set free. It's nothing that I've done. It's nothing that I've attained. It's because there is a faithful servant, Jesus Christ, who was faithful to the point of death. That's what Philippians chapter 2 tells us. And it's because of Jesus that we're here, that we have salvation. Philippians chapter 2 verse 13, it says, it is God who works in you both to do and to do for his good pleasure. It's because of Jesus Christ. And now in verse 26, we're introduced to a man named Jeroboam. He is the third person that God has raised up to come against Solomon's kingdom. And the writer here spends a little bit more time developing Jeroboam than he did Hadad or Rezon earlier. And we see in verse 26, then Solomon's servant. So that gives us a clue, you guys. Then Solomon's servant, Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, an Ephraimite from Zereda, whose mother was named Zeruiah, a widow, also rebelled against the king. He's the third one mentioned as a source of trouble for Solomon. And he's introduced as Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, an Ephraimite. Now, from this point on, Jeroboam will always be introduced as Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. And when we get to chapter 12 going on, he will be Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who did evil in the sight of the Lord. What a tag to have, right? To always be remembered as the one who done evil in the sight of the Lord. But he's now being introduced here. And the writer, it's interesting, didn't spend a whole lot of time with Hadad, the first adversary that was raised up against Solomon. Didn't spend a whole bunch of time with Rezon. Just said that they both gained some rebels and now they're coming back to Jerusalem. But the writer spends time developing Jeroboam. Why is that? Because Jeroboam will eventually become king. And he will do evil in the sight of the Lord. And so he's introduced as Jeroboam, son of Nebat. He was an Ephraimite. David was also a son of an Ephraimite, Jesse. We're told of that in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 12. It says, David was born of the Ephratite, or an Ephraimite, same thing, of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, who had 8 sons, and the man was old and advanced in years until the day of Saul. So a little bit background of Jeroboam. If you go to Israel today, one of the sites that you will go to is Jeroboam's altar. And it's the original altar that he set up in the region of Dan, because he wanted to have the worship there. And we'll get there eventually. Nebat. Jeroboam, son of Nebat. We see that his hometown was Zeredah, where the location is uncertain, but no more is really known about Nebat. But what's more interesting is that the writer is pointing out something here, that he points out right off the bat, that he is Solomon's servant. Think about that for a moment. A servant of Solomon. This means that he was more likely a royal official rather than some type of low-grade worker. When we look at chapter 11, verse 11, if you want to look back there just really quickly, you guys, we see what it said here. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this and not kept my covenant and my statutes which I have commanded you, I will surely turn the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. Not a servant, your servant. What is the writer telling us? See, these are subtle things that we need to pay attention to, because the writer is telling us something here that set us up for this verse. Because now it's telling us, then Solomon's servant. Will this be the one that receives the kingdom? There's a hint that the writer gives us. Of course, if we read on, we're going to read, right? That he will become the king. But the writer's doing an interesting interplay with words here. That if we quickly go over it too quickly, we won't see what the writer's doing here. In chapter 11, verse 11, the writer tells us that the kingdom will be torn and given to your servant. Okay, we tuck that in our minds. Now we get to verse 26, and the first thing that is mentioned about Jeroboam is then Solomon's servant. And now another clue is given by the mentioning of her name. Jeroboam's name, mother's name. That is a clue that the writer is given to us. Look what it says here. The mom's name is Zeruiah, and she's a widow. Interesting. Something that we can really pass through when we're just reading through it. But if you remember with me that there's only been 2 times in 1 Kings whose moms are mentioned. And there are reasons for that. Remember with me in chapter 1, verse 5, that Adonijah's mom was mentioned. Haggith. Remember with me that also in chapter 1, verse 11, Bathsheba, Solomon's mom, is mentioned. So the writer has been giving us clues from chapter 1 that whenever a mom's name is mentioned, that more than likely they're going to be heir to the kingdom, or at least on the throne, or at least attempted to be on the throne. But remember with me in chapter 1, verse 5, when it says Haggith, the mother of Adonijah, the writer was giving us a little bit of interplay of the drama that could have taken place between Bathsheba and Haggith. Haggith, being the mother of Adonijah, says, no, I want my Miho to be king. And Bathsheba says, no, I'm going to go. Nathan comes to her and says, didn't God promise that Solomon would be heir to the throne? So then Bathsheba goes to the king and says, did you not say, King David? So we see a little bit of drama between the mothers. Seems like there's always drama between women, right? I mean, I can wear the same shirt as Jeff and think, oh, that looks good on you, bro. If my wife and Irene wear the same shirt, they're like, she doesn't look good in that. Why is she wearing it? They can be like that, right? And the writer of 1 Kings was giving us kind of that interplay and really setting us up for now. Because when the moms are mentioned, he's given clues that Adonijah, remember, tried to take over the kingdom in a revolt. Now, the widows, the Zeruiah, is now mentioned because King Jeroboam is going to rebel against the king. And so the writer is giving us subtle hints here. And then what follows is that we will hear of mothers' names of kings who ascended to David's throne. We're going to see this in chapter 14. We're going to see this in chapter 15 and 22, and we'll see this in 2 Kings chapter 8. So we can say that because Jeroboam's mom is named at this point, will she become the queen mother? Her name is interesting. Zeruiah. Some commentators argue that her name means prostitute or whore. Other commentators argue that her name means leper or a suffering skin disease. But what's interesting is the words in Hebrew that the writer is using to describe his mother, because that has given us insight to what the kingdom is going to look like. This is what's interesting about what our writer's doing here. He's pointing out her name, which in Hebrew means skin disease, prostitute, evil, leper, and that's given us a foreshadow of the kingdom of Jeroboam. See, the writer is setting us up and telling us what is going to happen. And I think that's interesting. I think that's fascinating when we read through 1 Kings and we're able to see this. And we see that she was a widow. Probably more than likely may have died before Jeroboam was born. But Jeroboam's name means, may the people be many. What people? God's people? His people? But when you think of that name in English, may the people be many, doesn't that sound king-like? It sounds royalty. Commentators are divided when this name was given. It may be a throne name that was given to Jeroboam after he died and then became king, or after he had become king and died. But others believe that no, this is the name that is given to him before he was king. But what's interesting about this is that at the end of verse 26, what is it described, what he does? It says that he rebelled against the king. When we go on to read here, it doesn't tell us why. We can get some hints by what the writer is telling us, but it really doesn't tell us why. When we look at chapter 12, verse 2 or verse 4, you see that there is a concern that Jeroboam has. He was a royal official to Solomon, so he would see how the kingdom would be played out and how hard the people were working, and he makes a complaint. That is possible, but we're not given the reason. What's interesting is that when we looked at Hadad, the one that had been raised up as an adversary for the Lord, and we looked at Rezon, nothing was mentioned about what they did except that they were raised up as adversaries to the Lord. Well, that can be anything, right? It could be saying, we hate you, we hate you, we hate you. But when Jeroboam's described, it stated that he rebelled against the king. In other versions, it says he lifted up his hand against the king. He stirred up a tumult. He stirred up a rebellion. Look what it says here in verse 27. And this is what caused him to rebel to the king Solomon. Solomon had built the Milo and repaired the damages to the city of David, his father. The man Jeroboam was a mighty man of valor, and Solomon, seeing that this young man was industrious, made him the officer over all the labor force of the house of Joseph. In verse 29, Now it happened at the time when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem that the prophet Ahijah, the Shilonite, met him on the way and had clothed himself with a new garment, and the two were alone in the field. Then Ahijah took hold of the new garment that was on him and tore it into 12 pieces. And he said to Jeroboam, "Take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus says the Lord God, the God of Israel, behold, I will tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and I will give 10 tribes to you." In verse 32, "But he shall have one tribe for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city which I've chosen out of the tribe of Israel's, because they have forsaken me, and worship Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, Milcom, the god of the people of Ammon, and have not walked in my ways to do what is right in the Lord, and keep my statutes and my judgments. However, I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, because I have made him the ruler of all the days for the sake of my servant David, whom I've chose, because he kept my commandments and my statutes." So when we look back at the first part of verse 27, we see the cause of the rebellion. It doesn't give us a bunch of insight, but again, the reader is doing this intentionally, because what he's doing is he's given us subtleties of Jeroboam's heart. And this will, when we get into the part where it starts to say, "And Jeroboam, son of Nebat, did evil in the sight of the Lord," as I mentioned previously, it will be these things that we see. What's interesting sometimes, you guys, is that when we look at this rebellion here really briefly, we can say that man had a cause. He had a cause. So he had a right to go and cause a rebellion. Sometimes we see that within ministry. There's a rebellion because that person feels that they have the right to go and say things or to do things, or because they have a cause and it's right in the eyes of the Lord. We see the same thing. And here it says that Jeroboam rebelled against the king, a definite death penalty. But in his heart, he's all, doesn't matter. It's worth it. I'm right. And we see that's what's going on here. Another version of the first part, when it says, "And this is what caused him to rebel," another version says, "Here's the account of how he rebelled against the king." But either way, when we look at this first part of the verse, it's pretty puzzling. Because what follows is not the obvious explanation for the reason of the rebellion, nor is it an account of what Jeroboam has done. But the writer does something a little bit more important that can be, again, a subtlety. He's telling us something more important about Jeroboam, because he's telling us here in verses 27 and 28 the circumstances that Jeroboam's in, and then in verses 29 to 39, the things that changed Jeroboam's life. So the writer is, again, leaving us in suspense a little bit, but he's saying this is what caused the rebellion. But first, I'm going to give you the circumstances of Jeroboam, what he's in, and then we're going to show you what changed his life. And a lot of times as men, we see, Lord, okay, we have this thing in our hearts. What is it you're going to show me? And then we're anticipating that. And we're like, wait, Lord, where are you? And the Lord's like, wait a minute. I want to show you the circumstances of your life first, and then I'm going to show you how your life can be changed. And this is what interesting the writer's doing here about Jeroboam, because it kind of leaves us hanging. Because when we looked here in verse 27, it says, "And this is what caused the king Jeroboam to rebel against the king. Solomon had built Milo and repaired the damages to the city of David." That's all it's told. Well, to look at this a little bit more closely, Milo and repairing the walls where there was a breach there that the Bible does not discuss. And Solomon wanted that breach to be covered up and wanted repaired Milo because it would reinforce it for any enemies to come in and expose the city. But what's interesting, as we will see here in verse 28, is that Jeroboam was made as the officer over the labor force that was of the house of Joseph, an Ephraimite. What did the writer tell us that Jeroboam, son of Nebat, was from? He was an Ephraimite. And so now Solomon's using forced labor to close this gap and repair the wall, and Solomon is now in charge of that. Jeroboam's in charge of that. He is an officer. And he's seen his own people being treated as forced labor. This is why in chapter 12, verse 4, Jeroboam goes to Rehoboam and says, the yoke of your father was heavy upon us. That's all it's mentioned. So the writer is wanting us to think about, is that the reason for the rebellion? What's interesting is that that's not what the writer's wanting to point out. What the writer's wanting to point out is the character and the circumstances of Jeroboam. Because in verse 27, we see that this is what caused him to rebel. But in verse 28, it tells us a little bit about his valor. He was industrious. He was an officer. He was appointed over the house of Joseph for the forced labor. So we see that these circumstances, that Jeroboam is in a place that he is a high official within the kingdom of Solomon. In 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 15, and included verse 24, this is what it says. And this is the reason for the labor force which King Solomon raised to build up the house of the Lord, his own house, the Milo, the wall of Jerusalem, Hazar, Megiddo, and Gezer. But Pharaoh's daughter came up from the city of David to her house, which Solomon had built from her. Then he built Milo. Who do you think did all this work? It does tell us that there was a labor force early on in the chapters, that they were from Lebanon. Remember? King Hiram. And that the people that came to do the work were part of the contracted work that Solomon made with Hiram to build the temple and to build the holies of holies. And now it's changed. And what's interesting, and that's pointed out in 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 15, is that we see these continuous building projects. And it's the house of Joseph that were being used as the forced labor. And again, I wonder when we have to ask ourselves, when is too much too much? And we see these buildings that are being built and the slave labor. And there's always a cost for anything that we pursue. Anything that we pursue as men, there will always be people that suffer from it. And when Solomon completed his most important projects, he turned to a wider building program. There's a couple of verses, just for the sake of time, I want to move on. But it says in verse 27 that the repair to the damaged walls. So again, that these were exposures that Solomon was aware of. But he used the house of Joseph to do it, Ephraimites. And so we see that Jeroboam was, his abilities are revealed to us in verse 28. He's energetic, he's skillful, he's responsible, he's industrious, and he was noticed by King Solomon, who made him over the labor force of the house of Joseph. And so again, Jeroboam's own tribe of Ephraim, along with the relatives of Manasseh, were part of this house of Joseph. And this labor force that was managed by Jeroboam was not the workers that were mentioned in chapter 9, verse 22. So you see how the writer is now beginning to pull this all together. He points out that Jeroboam's an Ephraimite. Then in verse 28, that Jeroboam's an official over the labor force of the house of Joseph, and that Jeroboam is an official. His own tribe was stuck doing the hard labor. So we can see the potentials of rebellion. From Solomon's perspective, Jeroboam is a very serious enemy. Why? Why is there more time spent pointing out Jeroboam than there has been Hadad or Rezon? And why is it important that the writer points out that Jeroboam is a servant of Solomon? And why is it important that the writer is taking us the time to give us the skills and the abilities of Jeroboam? Why do you think he's doing that? I'm glad you guys asked me. Why is he more of a threat than those other two mentioned? Because he is an internal enemy. This is what makes it so dangerous. An internal enemy. Have you ever been part of something and there has been an internal enemy? That's what causes the greatest destruction. Not from the outside, but from within. And this is why the writer has taken the time to set Jeroboam up, because of the seriousness of the rebellion that took place within the kingdom. It's interesting what David speaks about in Psalm chapter 41, verse 9. Even my own familiar friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. The destruction that is caused when there is an enemy from within is devastating. Think about our families. The destruction that is caused when a husband or a wife is taken out. Or within our children. From within us. We can understand outside attacks and outside influences, but what about when it's within our family? Within our marriage? Within our church? This is why it's important that we understand why the writer is spending so much time describing the adversary that was raised up against Solomon, that was from within the kingdom. We must be aware of the enemy that will come in underneath enemy lines and try to settle in himself within our own territory. When we look at verse 29, it said when Jeroboam went out, he met this prophet named Ahijah. And this is the first time that this guy's mentioned. We haven't heard nothing of Nathan since he anointed King Solomon in chapter 1. And now this prophet Ahijah appears in the narrative, and suddenly he now has a word for Jeroboam. In verse 29, it talks about that this prophet met him on the way, and he had clothed himself with a new garment. The word garment in Hebrew it talks about a large square cloth, and it was a deliberate pun on Solomon's name in the Hebrew. The garment represents Solomon and his kingdom. But we see in verse 40 that Ahijah lays a hold of this garment that was on him, and he begins to tear it, and he tears it into 12 pieces. This is interesting. Why does he rip it up in 12 pieces? You guys say the 12 tribes, I hear it. But do the math, only 10 are mentioned. Why is that? Biblical scholars? I'm glad you guys asked. Come back next week and we'll answer that question. But as we witness this prophet carrying out, it appears to be small, but it's a very dramatic verse here. Because we've seen earlier that this kingdom was going to be torn out of his hand, and now the prophet goes to this man who's rebelled against the king. Now we start looking at timeline. Did this happen first and then he rebelled against the king? Or was that a part of Jeroboam's description that he will rebel against the king? We don't know. All we know now is that there's a dramatic scene here where he is approached by this prophet. Imagine being out there and this guy comes up to you and says, hey, take this new garment and I'm going to rip it up in 12 pieces. And you're like, what? And I could imagine what he's thinking. In history, the 12 reminds us of the nation of Israel that was divided into 12 tribes. But the second thing that will catch our attention here in verse 29 is that he tore. I'm sorry, in verse 30. And he tore it into 12 pieces. What's interesting about this is that in chapter 11, verse 11, God tells Solomon, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant. Years earlier, we know that this happened with King Saul. What time is it, you guys? We better stop right there, you guys. But we see that these pieces have been torn up into 12 pieces. And in verse 31, he says, take for yourself 10 pieces. But wait a minute. Wasn't the garment divided into 12 pieces? We're going to pick up there next week, you guys. Just a quick story before we close. Let me make a little note here. It's fancy, I know. Thank you for my birthday gift. It's obvious here that we're seeing a result of consequences to sin. And as men, we must always be aware of these tactics that the enemy is going to come against us. Because when we read this closely, and we're going to wrap up chapter 11 next week, it's interesting that all this came about because of disobedience. That's all it came about. I wonder if Solomon would have never turned his heart away, what the kingdom would have looked like. But we don't see that. We see that the kingdom has now been torn away, and it's been very descriptive in how Jeroboam is being introduced. And then the dramatic scene, we're going to pick up there again next week, that this prophet comes to him and begins to take this new garment off, and he's like, man, you just wasted $20 on that garment. You're ripping it up into 12 pieces. And 10's given to him. What is he thinking? We must be men that guard our hearts against any of those things that will tear the kingdom away from us. You know, a couple of weeks ago, you guys, there was a brother that Jeff Hatfield knows, and I've happened to know through, I used to go to NA meetings. And one time, you guys, I went to an NA meeting, and this guy was the sponsor. And that week, I had found, I'm going to be transparent, I had found 5 syringes full of meth. Syringes that I had stashed for a later date and forgot about them. Was looking for them, could never find them. And I remember going to the NA meeting, and it was before I started coming to Lion Tamers. And I remember excited that I found these, and not only did I find them, but I squirted them out. I didn't use them. And I went there excited to tell the sponsor about this great news. And he said to me, what kind of drug addict were you? Thank you for the encouragement. And he used some expletives. He goes, what kind of drug addict were you that would leave 5 syringes? Like, man, that was encouraging. He was always one of these guys that spoke his heart. Jeff called me the other day and said, you know what, he's pretty sick. So like, okay, well, we'll go pray. Jeff went to go one day and he wasn't there, and we went and prayed for him. And we get into his house, and he's lost a lot of weight. And we go in, and Jeff knocks on the door and walks right in, and I'm following, and I'm thinking, man, people think we must be like the FBI or something, you know, going to this guy's house. And we go inside the house, and I hear Jeff say, oh, you're in the bathroom. So we go in there, and he's there shaving. He's sitting on his walker, thin. And I was kind of startled, because when I saw him, I had known him. I seen him at Jeff's grandma's funeral, and he spoke there, and I always knew him this certain way. When I seen him, it kind of took me back. So we started talking, the 3 of us, and eternity came up. And we were sharing with him, when we're in situations like this, eternity's literally in the balance, right? We don't know how long, but literally eternity's in the balance. Where will you spend eternity? And he says, well, I'm right with God, and I have one foot in, and I hope that I will make it. And Jeff says, well, you don't have to hope. And at that moment, the conversation turned. Remember? It just turned. And he started talking about people he knew and who Jeff knew. And now I'm thinking, we're not going to pray for this guy. And then he says, okay, you guys, well, I better get ready. I have to go. Someone's picking me up. And I said, let's pray. Let's pray. Can we pray with you? Yeah, but someone's picking me up. We got to hurry. Fine, we'll pray. Father, in Jesus' name. And then at that moment, would you be willing to give your heart to the Lord? And he said, yes. And so he said the sinner's prayer. And I'm thinking, okay, on the way home, I was like, Jeff, do you think he was sincere? And Jeff's like, I think he was. And then I'm thinking, do we force it on him? Like we're going to get some brownie points in heaven or something? We're recruiters for the kingdom, But he repeated it. And on July 4th, he went home to be with the Lord. And I started thinking about, are we aware of those around us? Or are we so focused in our own world that we don't have the eyes to see what's going on around us? Are we caught up? Are our hearts turned away in other things, or are we kingdom-minded? Are we aware of those who may be around us that are literally crying out for help? And I'll just sharing with Jeff this morning, because his reluctancy, this guy, to pray and say the prayer, and he was saying, I hope. And I'm thinking, well, you don't have to hope, you can know. And I'm thinking, when he went before the Lord, I wonder if he thought of Jeff. After he said, I hope, I went and waited in the car for Jeff, like, you take care of this. No, I didn't do that, you guys. But I wonder if he said, man, I'm thankful for those guys that came and prayed for me. I'm thankful. Or maybe he's saying, I wish I would have meant it in my heart. Are we aware of those around us, men? So my challenge to us, as we see, and we'll pick up next week, as we're seeing Jeroboam being groomed by the reader, eventually he'll be a man that is known as Jeroboam, who's done evil in the sight of the Lord. May we always be men that do good in the sight of the Lord. May we be a men that build his kingdom and that we exude his love and his mercy and grace. Amen? Let's pray. Father, we thank you so much for this time, and Lord, for this study. I'm thankful for the writer that has given us so much clues about what's going on that we can easily blow through that. But that the Holy Spirit is able to say, hey, let's take a look at this. How does this apply as us men? That we're always on guard on what those things can raise up in our hearts. Lord, may we be men of unity, men of love, men of your grace. And Lord, we ask that you bless our fellowship together. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so our fellowship, our burritos and everything are in 204A and B. Just go through these doors, make a right. Not immediate right, you'll end up in the men's bathroom. But if you want to eat your burrito there, that's between you and the Lord. But if you want to go out, make the doors, make a right, and you'll see 204A and B. And Andy will be here in the back selling tickets for the men's barbecue. We'll see you guys over there. God bless you.